What if I told you the most powerful person in a medieval castle wasn't the king, but the guy wearing a ridiculously floppy hat? Being a royal fool was the most dangerous psychological game in human history. Today, we are exposing the bizarre, unwritten survival code that governed their entire existence. Prepare to learn how professional comedians weaponized laughter to outsmart executioners and secretly rule the ancient world. 1. Let's talk about the absolute legend named Triboulet. When this French jester crossed a dangerous line by slapping a powerful nobleman on the rear, the king sentenced him to death. But because of the unwritten rule that a great fool gets a final favor, the monarch allowed Triboulet to choose his exact method of execution. Without missing a single beat, the brilliant comedian declared he chose to die of old age. The king laughed so incredibly hard that he canceled the execution instantly. Having killer comedic timing literally saved your neck. 2. Getting kicked by a monarch was just another Tuesday, but it came with a highly specific legal caveat. Physical comedy back then wasn't about slipping on medieval banana peels. It often involved the king suddenly tossing the jester across a room during a royal tantrum. The unwritten rule dictated the fool had to instantly transform this assault into a spectacular comedic performance. However, if a regular nobleman tried that exact same abuse, the jester could demand severe financial compensation. They were an exclusive, tax-exempt punching bag. 3. Palace real estate for an entertainer was shockingly rough. Despite wielding immense psychological influence over the most powerful rulers in human history, many fools were officially classified in the royal ledgers right alongside the king's pets. This meant their mandatory sleeping quarters were frequently on the cold stone floor among the aggressive hunting hounds. It served as a calculated psychological tactic, constantly reminding the comedian that no matter how brilliant their political satire was, they were ultimately just another obedient animal. 4. Mourning was strictly forbidden for the guy in the funny hat. When a beloved royal family member died, the entire castle was plunged into months of heavy, silent grief. However, the jester was legally required to maintain their chaotic, cheerful persona. They were ordered to actively mock the solemn funeral proceedings and crack jokes about the afterlife. This wasn't cruel. It was a deeply philosophical rule meant to remind the grieving monarch that life absolutely must go on. It forced the royal fool to relentlessly smile even while their own heart was breaking. 5. The absolute most terrifying rule involved being a human shield. In extremely desperate military situations, kings would force their most loyal entertainer to dress in exact replicas of the royal armor and ride directly into the fiercest part of the battle. The strategy was to trick enemy archers and assassins into targeting the heavily disguised comedian instead of the actual monarch. Your ultimate purpose was to catch a deadly arrow meant for your boss. Would you trade a lifetime of luxury if you knew it might end by taking a bullet for the CEO? 6. Table manners simply did not exist for the guy in the funny hat. While any foreign dignitary would be executed for treason just for reaching too close to the royal goblet, the fool was actively expected to brazenly snatch prime cuts of meat right off the monarch's personal plate. This chaotic behavior wasn't just to get cheap laughs from the drunk barons. It served as a bizarre display of psychological dominance, proving to everyone in the grand hall that the jester operated completely outside the rigid boundaries of ordinary human laws. 7. Striking it rich through comedy came with a devastating legal catch. Kings absolutely loved rewarding a hilarious performance by casually gifting their favorite jesters massive country estates and heavy bags of gold. Yet, the crown permanently classified these entertainers as legal infants who could never manage their own financial affairs. The monarch would appoint a noble guardian who inevitably skimmed most of the profits. You were simultaneously a wealthy landowner and a completely penniless dependent caught in a totally broken tax bracket. 8. Medical emergencies in the throne room required immediate theatrical mirroring. If a Tudor monarch complained about a mild toothache, the entertainer couldn't just offer sympathy. The rules dictated he had to dramatically throw himself onto the stone floor, weeping loudly and loudly begging for an apothecary to amputate his entire jaw. This absurd overreaction was intentionally designed to make the king laugh at his own minor misery. In a strange way, a grown man acting like a toddler in agony was the earliest form of medieval pain medication. 9. Frontline combat duty wasn't limited to the heavily armored knights. When war broke out, jesters weren't allowed to hide safely behind the castle walls. They were ordered to stand directly in the bloody war zone, wearing their incredibly bright, highly visible outfits and scream deeply personal insults at the opposing army. Their entire job was to severely damage enemy morale before the deadly arrows started flying. 10. Dropping character was treated as a severe occupational hazard. Unlike modern actors who can take off their makeup and go home, the royal fool was on the clock every single second they were inside the palace walls. Showing genuine sadness, fear, or profound boredom in front of the monarch could instantly cost them their privileged status, or worse. They had to maintain a facade of manic energy even while grieving personal losses. It was a golden cage where the rent was paid exclusively in smiles, no matter how much their actual soul was hurting. 11. Delivering catastrophic news was essentially a jester's monopoly. When the French fleet was entirely annihilated by the English at Spies in 1340, the royal advisors were absolutely terrified to tell King Philip VI. So, the court fool casually strolled in and complained about those cowardly English sailors lacking the guts to jump into the freezing sea, like the brave Frenchman did. The monarch figured out the horrific defeat instantly, yet the entertainer kept his head. Honestly, would you ever risk your own life just to deliver an epic punchline to a guy with an executioner on speed dial? 12. Wardrobe requirements were strictly enforced and deeply humiliating. The iconic motley pattern of bright, clashing colors wasn't a cool fashion statement. It was a deliberate visual marker designed to strip the entertainer of any social class. By wearing mismatched fabrics, usually reserved for beggars, the fool became a walking contradiction who belonged nowhere in the rigid feudal system. This forced exclusion was exactly what gave them the freedom to mock everyone from the lowest peasant to the highest duke. Do you think you could pull off that outfit? 13. Awkward silence was technically a severely punishable offense. If the dining hall suddenly went quiet during a feast, the jester was legally obligated to fill the void instantly. Whether that meant doing dangerous backflips over a massive wooden table or singing a highly offensive song about the queen's mother, hesitation meant risking your cushy palace job. They were the original panic button entertainers. Imagine having your entire livelihood depend on never letting a single conversation die down at a massive corporate dinner party. Sounds exhausting, right? 14. Dietary restrictions were wildly unique. These performers rarely ate with the common servants in the kitchen. Instead, the rules dictated they eat whatever the king physically left on his personal plate. While this sounds slightly degrading, it meant the comedian was consuming the absolute highest quality truffles, imported spices, and prime roasted meats in the entire kingdom. They were essentially human garbage disposals, but they ate significantly better than most visiting dukes. Dining on royal scraps was secretly the ultimate culinary lottery. 15. The iconic floppy hat actually carried a hidden, highly sacred meaning. Those 3 dangling points on a typical jester's cap weren't just random places to hang annoying silver bells. They specifically represented donkey ears and a rooster's comb. It was a bizarre symbolic shield, signaling to the world that this particular person was protected by divine stupidity. Harming a fool wearing this specific hat was considered profoundly bad luck. It was essentially the medieval equivalent of wearing a high-visibility safety vest, just much more ridiculous. 16. Female jesters absolutely existed, and the rules for them were fiercely ruthless. Take Mathurin, a famous female fool at the French court in the 17th century. She wasn't expected to be polite or ladylike. In fact, protocol demanded she be just as loud, obnoxious, and politically aggressive as her male counterparts. She actually walked around dressed as a terrifying Amazonian warrior, loudly roasting visiting foreign ambassadors. She proved that quick wit and sharp insults were the ultimate equalizers in a heavily male-dominated aristocratic society. 17. Being a human spy was an unofficial but crucial part of the job description, because everyone assumed the colorful guy juggling wooden balls in the corner was a complete idiot. Elite diplomats would freely discuss treasonous political plots right in front of him. The unwritten rule was that the jester had to quietly memorize these highly classified secrets and filter them back to the king through subtly coded jokes at dinner. They were the original undercover intelligence agents hiding in plain sight. Laughter was the absolute best cover story ever invented. 18. Grooming standards dictated that haircuts must be as ugly as humanly possible. To ensure nobody could ever take them seriously during a casual conversation, many fools were forced to alter their appearance drastically. They shaved their heads in bizarre reverse mohawks, leaving weird, patchy patterns of baldness. This visual degradation was a strict rule to constantly reinforce their lowly status. Even when they were speaking profound philosophical truths, the ridiculous haircut ensured the surrounding nobility would still treat them like an absolute joke. 19. Truth in the Middle Ages was a luxury paid for with blood, unless you were officially insane. The most crucial survival strategy involved mastering the illusion of clinical madness. Questioning a monarch's tax policy would normally result in a highly public execution. But if a jester wrapped his brutal political criticism in bizarre riddles and frantic physical gibberish, the king dismissed it as the meaningless babble of a broken mind. This artificial insanity was the ultimate medieval legal loophole, allowing them to openly roast the government. 20. Paying municipal taxes was strictly for peasants, never for the king's comedians. Jesters enjoyed a bizarre level of total financial immunity. When traveling between cities, they were legally exempt from paying expensive bridge tolls, gate fees, or local trade taxes. The rule stated all they had to do was tell a clever joke to the guards or perform a quick tumbling routine, and the heavy medieval turnstile would open completely for free. It was essentially the early 14th century equivalent of an influencer paying for their expensive groceries with exposure. 21. Interrupting highly classified government meetings was actively encouraged. If the king was in an incredibly tense, closed-door session with his elite war council, no ordinary servant would ever dare enter. But the jester had a permanent hall pass to kick the heavy wooden doors open, waltz right in, and crack a bizarre joke to relieve the overwhelming tension. The monarch actually relied heavily on this chaotic intrusion to break up bitter arguments between generals. They functioned as the living, breathing equivalent of a modern workplace wellness break. 22. Physical retaliation against angry nobility was strictly prohibited by law. If a highly intoxicated, aggressive baron decided to punch a jester right in the face during a feast, the fool absolutely could not throw a punch back without facing execution. Instead, the golden rule dictated they had to use their razor-sharp wit to socially destroy that specific baron's reputation forever. They waged a brutal psychological war using devastating public humiliation instead of swords. Would you be able to verbally destroy someone who just punched you in the jaw? 23. Retirement plans for the royal fool usually involved forced religious confinement. When a jester got too old, their joints hurt too much to tumble, or their jokes simply went stale, they were rarely just fired. The standard rule was for the king to generously purchase them a permanent spot in a quiet monastery. After a long lifetime of heavy drinking, feasting, and mercilessly mocking the church, these aging comedians were suddenly forced to spend their twilight years living under strict vows of absolute silence, alongside highly confused and annoyed monks. 24. You had to blindly accept being treated as a high-end luxury gift. Monarchs routinely gave their absolute favorite jesters away to other European kings as a weird, living diplomatic flex. As a fool, you could comfortably wake up in a damp London castle and legally be shipped off to a scorching palace in Spain by Tuesday, simply because your boss wanted to impress a visiting royal. Your entire life, family, and career could be uprooted in an instant just because you told a joke that a foreign ambassador happened to find slightly too amusing for his own good. 25. Animal sidekicks were practically mandatory, and they often had to wear matching outfits. A jester rarely worked completely alone. They were strictly required to train a dog, a monkey, or even a pig to perform absurd tricks alongside them. The twisted part of the rule? The king would often force the jester to dress their animal in miniature versions of a rival lord's clothing. This allowed the fool to viciously mock powerful political enemies by proxy, casually talking to a dressed-up pig as if it were the highly respected Duke of Burgundy. It was pure genius. 26. The absolute craziest day of the entire year involved a total inversion of power called the Feast of Fools. During this incredibly bizarre winter festival, the strict rules of the medieval society were completely flipped. The lowest-ranking jester was officially crowned the Lord of Misrule. For a few glorious days, he actually had the legal power to command the king, issue ridiculous fake laws, and force the highest nobles to serve him cheap wine. It acted as a brilliant societal pressure valve, preventing bloody revolutions by letting peasants pretend to rule. 27. Taking the literal public blame for embarrassing royal mistakes was a crucial part of the gig. If the king made a completely humiliating social blunder or spilled wine all over himself at a massive diplomatic feast, the jester was expected to immediately cause a massive, chaotic distraction. The unwritten rule demanded they trip over a table or set their own hat on fire, just to draw all the negative attention away from the crown. You were highly paid to be the ultimate medieval scapegoat. Could you handle taking the fall every time your boss messed up? 28. Wordplay was valued vastly more than cheap acrobatics. While modern media loves to portray jesters as colorful circus freaks doing backflips, the unwritten hierarchy of the court strictly prioritized intellectual wit. Throwing knives or doing handstands was considered low-tier entertainment, meant for dirty street fairs. To survive in the royal court, your mind had to be significantly sharper than a broadsword. If you could only juggle but absolutely couldn't debate deep philosophy while insulting a visiting lord's mother, you would be thrown out into the mud. 29. Complete immunity from the law applied, but only within the protective castle walls. A jester could steal the king's wine and slap a powerful duke without consequence inside the throne room. But the absolute moment they stepped foot outside into the public streets, they were just another vulnerable commoner. If they tried their arrogant comedic routines on a grumpy, muscular medieval blacksmith in the town square, they would get arrested or beaten instantly. Their incredible superpower was strictly tied to their geographical proximity to the reigning monarch. 30. You could never hold actual political office, no matter how much of a genius you were. Even if a jester accurately predicted enemy troop movements or saved the entire kingdom from financial ruin with a remarkably clever riddle, the law explicitly forbade them from becoming an official royal advisor. Their absolute brilliance always had to remain firmly categorized as a silly joke. They held immense shadow power, whispering directly into the ear of the king, but they could never take any public credit for the historical decisions they secretly manipulated. 31. Acting as a medieval therapist was an unwritten but mandatory duty. When monarchs suffered from deep, debilitating depression, the court physicians didn't prescribe pills. They prescribed the royal jester. These performers were required to spend days in dark, locked rooms with melancholy kings, using carefully crafted humor to pull them back from the brink of total mental collapse. It wasn't just about getting a quick laugh. It was an incredibly high-pressure psychological rescue mission. The fate of the entire kingdom often depended on a comedian's ability to cure a monarch's profound sadness. 32. The performers operated under a very specific, fiercely guarded legal concept known as the privilege of freedom. This wasn't modern free speech. It was an exclusive royal license to slander anyone they wanted. As long as the entertainer stayed within the bounds of their comedic persona, they could casually accuse a high-ranking bishop of embezzlement or roast a notoriously violent knight. They essentially possessed diplomatic immunity, but purely for stand-up comedy. However, crossing an invisible, undefined line meant that immunity vanished instantly. 33. Defensive agility was vastly more important than juggling skills. Because these satirists were constantly hurling deeply personal, devastating insults at highly armed, severely stressed noblemen, they had to be ready for the inevitable physical backlash. A crucial rule of the trade was mastering the art of dodging heavy silver goblets, flying plates, and half-eaten turkey legs thrown at their heads. They essentially had to be medieval ninjas, hiding in bright, embarrassing outfits. If you couldn't dodge a heavy plate, your career would be incredibly short. 34. Morning routines were completely devoid of privacy. While elite advisors had to wait hours outside the throne room for an official audience, the royal comedian had a VIP all-access pass to the king's private bedroom. They were strictly required to be there the moment the monarch opened his eyes, cracking jokes while the ruler was literally putting on his pants. This gave them unparalleled, intimate access to the most powerful person in the realm. Would you want your boss in your bedroom right when you wake up, demanding you be absolutely hilarious? 35. Privacy. During bathroom breaks simply did not apply to the reigning monarch's absolute favorite jester. While a king handled his intimate morning business on the royal commode, the fool was often ordered to stand right there in the tiny room. Their designated duty was to distract the ruler from any sudden digestive discomfort by delivering rapid-fire political gossip and highly inappropriate jokes. The absolute highest level of royal trust was defined by exactly who was allowed to make you laugh out loud while you were trapped on a drafty medieval toilet. 36. Kitchen staff absolutely dreaded the sudden arrival of the court jester. While official royal tasters checked grand banquets for deadly poison, the royal fool was strictly ordered to brutally critique the actual culinary quality of the feast. If a roasted swan was entirely too dry or the wine tasted sour, the jester would dramatically spit it out onto the stone floor and loudly shame the head chef in front of hundreds of guests. Would you have the courage to publicly humiliate a heavily armed medieval butcher over a slightly burnt pie crust to amuse a king? 37. Romantic lives were heavily monitored and often entirely arranged by the crown. Kings occasionally forced their favorite entertainers to marry each other, viewing it as a bizarre, real-life aristocratic breeding experiment. The monarch hoped these arranged unions would produce an entire lineage of naturally gifted, highly sarcastic performers for future generations. Your heart didn't belong to you. It belonged to the state's entertainment budget. Imagine your CEO forcing you to marry a coworker, just hoping your kids would be exceptionally good at corporate presentations. 38. Roasting the one man who could legally end your life was a highly dangerous requirement. A top-tier court jester was fully expected to publicly mock the royal executioner. This was a calculated psychological tactic meant to ease the heavy tension surrounding the kingdom's most intimidating official. The comedian had to make the menacing guy holding the executioner's axe look like a bumbling, completely harmless worker. It was an incredibly delicate tightrope walk of humor. One bad joke, and your final appointment with that exact official could become incredibly unpleasant. 39. Transportation protocols during massive royal processions were specifically designed to be as disorienting as possible. While knights rode proudly on heavy war horses, the entertainer was often ordered to ride a small donkey completely backward. Their job was to face the trailing entourage and keep the exhausted servants laughing during brutal, multi-day journeys across freezing terrain. It was medieval crowd control mixed with severe motion sickness. Could you perform an hour of sharp stand-up comedy while bouncing backward on a stubborn mule? 40. Plagiarism was treated as a severe physical crime. In the modern comedy world, stealing a joke might get you severely criticized online. But in the royal courts, if an entertainer was caught directly stealing a clever riddle or a highly specific insult from a rival performer, the penalty wasn't just professional embarrassment. The unwritten rule demanded severe physical punishment, often resulting in a harsh public whipping. Originality wasn't just a matter of artistic pride. It was a strictly enforced legal requirement to keep your skin fully intact. 41. Feigning complete illiteracy was a brilliant strategic requirement. Many of these top-tier entertainers were secretly highly educated, capable of reading Latin and complex legal texts. However, the survival rule was to pretend they couldn't even read their own name. This allowed them to casually glance over the shoulders of powerful dukes who were reading highly classified letters, absorbing state secrets while maintaining a blank, clueless expression. They weaponized society's low expectations to become the most informed people in the entire castle. 42. Providing extreme marital counseling was an unwritten royal requirement. While no nobleman would ever dare criticize the powerful queen, the court jester was legally obligated to roast the monarch's spouse. If the royal couple was trapped in a bitter, silent argument, the fool would openly mock their marital issues in front of the entire court. This forced both rulers to laugh at the sheer absurdity of the insult, breaking the icy tension. They essentially saved royal marriages by using aggressive public humiliation to force the couple back onto the exact same page. 43. Serving as the kingdom's most secure postal service was a hidden duty. Because absolutely no one questioned a vividly dressed performer wandering aimlessly through the palace corridors at midnight, kings frequently used them to deliver highly confidential love letters to secret mistresses. If caught by a suspicious queen, the comedian would simply eat the parchment or pretend it was a prop for a new song. They were the perfect, unquestionable couriers for the monarchy's most scandalous, marriage-destroying extracurricular activities. 44. Quarantine protocols meant working major overtime without breaks. When a widespread medieval outbreak swept through the countryside, the wealthy nobility would lock themselves inside heavily guarded castles to wait out the crisis safely. The comedian was strictly required to lock down right there with them. Their job instantly shifted from casual entertainment to vital morale support, forced to perform relentlessly to keep the terrified ruler's mind completely off the grim reality outside the stone walls. You were essentially the sole provider of psychological relief during a massive kingdom-wide lockdown. 45. Kings often wanted to deeply insult arrogant foreign ambassadors, but couldn't do it directly without triggering a massive bloody war. The rule was to deploy the jester. The performer would absolutely roast the visiting dignitary's culture, clothing, and ruler. The king would then pretend to be outraged, apologize profusely, and claim the comedian simply didn't know any better. It was the ultimate passive-aggressive political strike. Wouldn't you love to have a designated insulter at your workplace? 46. Royal weddings required heavily inappropriate commentary. While modern weddings have touching, emotional speeches, aristocratic marriages were usually tense, loveless political business transactions. The jester was mandated to act as the official roast master at the banquet, shouting highly inappropriate, wildly unhinged jokes about the newlyweds to cut the thick, awkward tension in the room. They said exactly what everyone was secretly thinking, but was entirely too terrified to voice aloud. They were the medieval equivalent of a completely unfiltered uncle. 47. Getting fired meant completely losing your public identity. If a performer finally crossed the ultimate line and lost the monarch's favor without getting executed, the punishment was known as being stripped of the motley. The guards would physically tear the colorful, iconic clothing off their back. Without that specific uniform, the strict rules of societal protection completely vanished. They couldn't perform anywhere else and were instantly reduced to the absolute lowest rung of peasant society, erased from history in a single, humiliating wardrobe change. 48. Networking wasn't just for rich merchants. Professional jesters formed their own secretive, highly exclusive theatrical guilds. In 15th century France, an organization called the Children Without Worry operated essentially as a strict legal comedy union. They shared material, protected each other from angry politicians, and strictly regulated who was actually allowed to perform certain types of cutting satire. If an unlicensed performer tried to steal their gig, the guild would publicly ruin their reputation. It was a remarkably sophisticated monopoly disguised as a silly club. 49. Discipline in the throne room took a bizarrely creative turn for these court fools. If a jester crossed a line but the offense wasn't severe enough for banishment, the monarch would impose a strict linguistic quarantine. The punishment required the fool to speak exclusively in perfectly rhyming couplets for an entire week. If they broke the rhyme scheme even once, they lost their daily wages. This grueling mental marathon turned a simple request for water into an exhausting poetry slam. Could you survive your workday speaking only in strict rhythmic verse? All right, we have covered 49 points, and there is only one final point remaining. But before we move to number 50, it is time for our final verdict. In our opinion, the award for the wildest rule from today's list goes to providing extreme marital counseling. Purposely roasting a furious king and his powerful queen during a bitter, silent argument just to break the ice sounds like an absolute suicide mission. Do you agree with our verdict? Or did another point earn this questionable honor? Let us know in the comments. And now, our final number. 50. Even in death, the carefully crafted jester persona had to remain perfectly intact. When drafting their final testaments, these royal fools were legally permitted to leave incredibly sarcastic bequests to the highest members of the government. Historical records show jesters officially leaving their utter lack of common sense to the king's top generals, or bequeathing an empty wallet to the notoriously greedy chancellor. These legally binding roasts were read aloud in open court, allowing the fool to deliver one final epic punchline from beyond the grave. The royal jester wasn't just a clown. They were brilliant psychological survivors navigating a deadly maze of royal egos. They proved that laughter is the ultimate shield against absolute power. Would your current sense of humor get you promoted in a royal court or sent straight to the dungeon? Drop your honest answer in the comments. Subscribe for more deep cuts into history, and see you next time.